Okay, welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to be adding both control of the player's movement in the XZ plane, or this ground plane. We're also going to be just looking at how to add an image as part of our, or a texture map as it will be called, as part of our materials, because it just makes it a little easier to see the ball spinning and also to kind of keep track of where we are on the plane. And so we're going to be looking at XZ motion for our player, and we're also going to be looking at how to create a script so that a visual script using Bolt, so that the camera follows our player around kind of in a bird's eye view of what's going on. And so to demonstrate that, I'll just go ahead and hit play real quick, and then we'll get to making this thing happen. So if I press the D and A keys, the ball will move left and right. Now this is all being controlled through the physics engine, so I'm not touching the keys right now, but I've added some force in this direction, and so it's going to keep going until I put force in the opposite direction or friction runs out. And right now there's no real friction or anything. I don't have a physics material on here that's going to slow this thing from rolling, so it's just going to keep going until it falls off the edge. All right, but so you can see as I move around this map, the camera is tracking with it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop that, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So the first thing you should do is, ideally you're still using the same tutorial that we started on. I'm going to go to scenes, and so this is where I've applied these materials, so now they're everywhere because it's the same assets that are being used, but that's all right. So you should be here. Let me go ahead and get rid of that material really quick on the two objects that we're going to pull from here, just so we can, just so we can have this be back in the normal state. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is to select our plane and our sphere. These are the only assets that we're going to need. What we're going to do is, because we've already got kind of a lot going on in this scene, I mean, it's not a ton, but I want to really be able to focus on the two things that we need to do, right, and not worry about any of the dominoes right now. We're just going to migrate these things out, work on them, and then we can bring the graphs and stuff back in. And they may even apply, because we're going to be using the same assets, they may even apply even though we're working in a different scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select both of those two objects. I'm going to hit Command or Control C to copy them. And then what I need to do is create a new scene. So I'm just going to go up to File, at the top of the screen, and New Scene, or hit Command or Control N. As soon as I create that new scene, something you should get in the habit of doing is saving the scene immediately, right? You'll notice it says it's untitled. And if Unity crashes, which Unity is prone to do at the worst possible times, and you've done a bunch of work in this scene, but you haven't saved the scene yet, all of that will vanish, right? Even though you've saved the project, it's still not saving the scene. And so what we need to do is we need to just go to File and go to Save. And when we do that, it's going to open this thing up, and what it's saving is the scene, right? It's not saving our whole project. It's actually saving our scene in the project. So I'm going to call this XZ motion tutorial, and I'm just going to go ahead and save it. And actually, I could take this, and instead of just saving it in the assets folder, which I don't know if you have this full. This is what it looks like usually in Mac OS. If you click that little arrow, you get a little bit more freedom. And I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to make sure I put this in my scenes folder. There we go. My mouse just decided to stop working for a second. Okay, so I'm going to save that. Okay, so I've dropped these two objects in here. Now, it just occurred to me that because I've already created this script on this sphere, I'm going to need to create a new sphere. This is a step you don't need to do. So I'm just going to hide this one completely. and maybe even make it not function at all. And I'm going to create a new sphere. Again, you should already be in a good spot with this. But there's a couple things we are going to do with this new sphere. So first, I'm going to go ahead and rename this to just player. So you can go ahead and with the sphere that you should have that has these scripts in there in the graph, you should go ahead and just create a new. You should just right click on it and rename it to player. That just makes life a little bit easier. And then the other thing I want you to do is to adjust the position, rotation, and scale of this object. And so you'll notice in my case, it's halfway through the ground plane here. And it's also, I'd like it to be a little bit bigger. And you'll see it's not quite in the center of the universe. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on these little dots. And if I just click reset up here, it will reset everything, right? Yours is actually probably floating up in the air some, but it'll reset all of this to where it should be. Now that I've reset all of that, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make the scale, instead of 1, I'm just going to make it 2 to start with in all 3 dimensions. And then I'm going to set the Y position to 1. And what that does, right, is it's going to put it up so it's just like a hair above the plane instead of intersecting it. Because if it's intersecting it, then we have a lot of problems with physics. And it might make the sphere just shoot off into space somewhere as soon as we start the game. And we'll talk about that's a great way to make things explode, is by having their colliders touching when the game begins. But instead, we have it set to 1. And so I'm going to add the things that I need to add. You should already have these components. So let me do this real quick, and then we will continue. Okay, now I'm back where you should be at with yours. I have currently I have one variable. There's probably something I've made. There's probably something over here that's that needs to be added, but I'm not worried about the domino pickups on this object yet. All I'm worried about, at least for my case, is making sure that the jumping is still working, which it's doing, and we can continue on from there. So the first thing we're going to do is right now. We have a physic material applied to, you may have it applied to the character, to the player, and to the floor, or the ground plane. I have it applied to the ground plane, right, which is allowing this bounce to happen. In order to make our life easier, what we're going to do is we are going to get rid of those materials for the time being. And that's just because it's going to make debugging what's going on a lot easier if the things aren't bouncing all over. So if I select the plane and I come over here, you'll see that under the mesh collider, which may be closed up, I'm not sure. But if I click on the mesh collider, so all the options are open, you'll see I have my material here. And you might remember that we created this physics material in an earlier tutorial to allow us to have bounce. This is also where we would set friction and things like that. But for the time being, we're just going to click on that little dot over there, and we're going to select none. And in my case, because I created a new sphere, I do not have that material attached here. But if you have a material here in your sphere collider, go ahead and select none as well, because usually you would have had ball or maybe new physics material in there instead. All right, so just make sure those are off, so then this won't bounce. It'll just come up and it'll land smoothly. Okay, so now we're ready to get started. So we've got our jump here, and there are a couple different ways that we could continue to do keyboard input and other types of input. Now, there's one of the issues with this on keyboard input event means that if you wanted to say use, many more keys on your keyboard to do different things, you would need one of these events for every single key, and that gets really intense. Unity has an input system, right, that already maps different named things. Specifically, what we're going to be looking at today are the horizontal and vertical axes, right? And what this means is you can map those to many different things, but by default, they're mapped. The vertical axis is mapped to the W and S key and the up and down arrow keys. And it's also mapped, and then the horizontal is mapped to the A and D keys or the left and right keys. And the way motion and all of this stuff works in Unity is that the Z, this blue arrow, and the direction it points is the forward direction of your collider, your character, whatever it is, right? That's the forward direction. So when I press W on the keyboard, I should be moving in the direction of the blue arrow. When I press S, I should be moving opposite the direction of the blue arrow. And when I press A and D, I would be moving along the x-axis, right? So I can't remember. D is probably this direction and A is probably that direction. That's something that we'll experiment with in a minute. But rather than having to do keyboard inputs for each one of those directions and deal with, well, what does it mean if we press the A key or the D key? What Unity has done is they've created these axes, right? And so all it is it's a value from 0 to 1, or it's actually from -1 to 1. If you press A, you get a -1. If you press D, you get a +1. And if you don't press anything, you get a 0, right? And the same goes for W and S. Now, there's another option called raw axis, which is almost identical, except it gives you a range of values between 0 and 1 or 0 and -1. In this case, all we need is +1, -1, or nothing. And so because of that, there's this input system that allows us to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to need to get this stuff out of the way, and we're going to want to zoom out a ways to start with. I'm just going to zoom out a bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and select by clicking and dragging both of these. I'm just going to pull them. Oops, somehow that group. Okay, well, I'm going to select the group, the domino pickup group, and hold down Shift and select this group, and then I'm going to click and drag. I'm going to get these up out of the way a little bit so I have some more space. Now, another way we can move around here, which I don't remember if I said in the last tutorial, is if you hold down Option or Alt and click and drag, you can actually drag your way around this view. And so what we need to do is we're going to need input, right? Second, we know that we are going to be moving in the Z direction and moving in the X direction. And so we're definitely going to want, we're probably going to be dealing with the rigid body in some sense or fashion, right? Like we previously did with the jump script. But instead of just dealing with Y, what we're going to be dealing with is the X and the Z. And in the past, we used this velocity, and we just set the velocity of the Y direction. But I told you, and I don't remember if in the tutorial we looked at what happened, but that isn't a good way to deal with motion in the X and Z directions. There's a better way to do this, and it's through a function or a method called add force. And so what we're going to do is first we need input. So I'm going to click on add unit, and I'm just going to type in capital I input. And when I do this, there's this input in Unity engine, and this is the one that we're looking for, right? This input and nesting we're actually going to talk about very shortly, because we can create what are called super units. And when you have something that a group of units you use a lot, and it's annoying to do all of that, you can create a super unit that does all that. And we're going to work on that today as well. But first, we're just going to say input in Unity. And there's all of these options down here, right? There's a ton of different options. But what we're going to do is we want to do the get axis. So, right, so you can also just access it by saying input.get and then axis, right? And you'll see there's the get axis raw. We're not going to worry about that right yet. So I'm going to select that. And you'll see that there is the flow input, the flow output, the axis name field here, and then some value that comes out of here, which is a float. And I believe it might be an int. I can't remember. If I hover over it, I was hoping it would tell me, but it does not. Whatever the case, if seeing this flow means I need some event to happen. Now, the event that I want to have happen to be getting this input, rather than it being a keyboard event, what we're going to be using is we're going to be using the update event, right? So every time the frame updates, every time the game runs through one of its loops and updates, we want to be checking to see if there's any input in this axis. And whatever that input is, we're going to spit out, it's going to be spit out here. So I'm going to go ahead and right click. I'm going to click add unit. And I can just type in update. When I do that, it's my first one. Now you'll note there are 3 different types of update. And we'll talk about when to use a fixed update versus late update versus normal update. For this, we're going to be using the regular update. So I need my update, so I need this to be able to flow into here. Now, the other thing I need is a name. And so what I'd like you to do is we're going to look briefly at the input manager and talk about it a touch, and then we're going to move on. Now, Unity does have a new input system that they're working on. I am not that familiar with it, and it's not the default at this point. And even just dealing with it with Bolt seems like kind of a nightmare. So, so I rather than take on 2 new things at once, we're going to use the old input system to begin with. So I'm going to go up to File, or sorry, I'm going to go up to Edit. I'm going to go down to Project Settings, and I'm going to click on Input Manager. Now, when I do that, there's absolutely nothing here. Now, you'll see it says this is using the Input API, and it says consider using the new input system package instead. Eventually, we will do that, but right now, we're going to use the old one just to make this easier. So you'll see that there's this little drop down that says axes. And there's the size, and then there's all of these different names, right? So there's horizontal, vertical, Fire 1, Fire 2. Some of these are not so much axes as they are, right? If I open up Fire 1, you'll see the name is here. The positive button is left control. The alt button is mouse 0, which would be the, which is usually a left click. And there's this gravity, dead, sensitivity. It tells you the type and what axis it is and blah, 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 blah. To start with, what we're focused on are the horizontal and vertical axes, right? And so horizontal, it says the negative button is left, which means left arrow. The positive button is right, right arrow, A and D. And then there's some settings here, this snap, and then it, tells you what type and all of that. But so the names are all in here. So we have horizontal and vertical. Those are the ones that we're going to be using. And you'll note that there's there's a duplication here, and this allows you to have it mapped to a joystick axis as well, right? So the first set maps this to the WASD and the arrow keys. The second one specifically maps it to a joystick axis, right? And it takes a while to figure out which axis is which on joysticks because they're all numbered and named differently. And that's a tutorial for another day. But so what we're interested in are these names. And I want you to note the names are capitalized, and that's really important because what we're going to do in order to set this up is to come down here, and to start with, we're going to start with the horizontal axis. So if I click an axis name, what I need to type in there is capital HOR horizontal. Now I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit so you can, if you don't know how to spell horizontal, you can actually see it on the screen. Right, so we want that horizontal axis. Remember, it's got to be capitalized. Well, I'll show you what happens if we don't do that. So we're getting our input from one of our axes. And then we need to take that input and we need to do a couple of things to it. But we know that the rigid body is what is controlling where this thing is in the world. And so we need to be able to do something to that rigid body. And what we need to do is we need to be able to add a certain amount of force to the rigid body. And so we're going to right click and we're going to add a unit, and we're going to type in rigid body dot add force. And there are several options here. because we don't want to add just X, Y, Z force all at once. We're just controlling the X and Z modes. And really, we don't even need to worry about this mode option here right now. All we want is this rigid body add force X, Y, Z, because that means that we have the X, Y, and Z inputs. And so they're already split out rather than it being like a full vector 3 that we have to deal with, which would be additional steps. Okay, so we know we want this to go horizontal, should be the motion in the X direction. So we know we want to connect this here. However, this motion, as I said, is it's only 1 or -1 or 0. That means that if we just went straight to this, it's going to be a very, very slow moving thing. We could try that real quick and just see what happens. So if I go ahead and run this, we'll see it might give me an error as well because I haven't added another thing to it. But okay, so it should be running now. So if I go ahead and press D on the keyboard, you'll see that, right, I'm getting some motion, and if I press A on the keyboard, it's taking a while to turn me back around. Now the reason for this is each time I have the key pressed, I'm adding essentially an additional 1 unit or -1 unit of force to the object. So that means like over 60 times a second, that force is going to be getting larger and larger and larger, or however many my frames are going, right? And so I am getting motion, but I don't have a lot of control over it, and I'd like to be able to control that speed and do a few other things. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this. And so there's a couple other units we need in here. Now, one of these, it's something that didn't necessarily make sense to me for a long time, but there's something with the amount of time that's changed that we need to talk about. So first, we're going to need something to multiply this by so we can actually control how much force we're adding per frame. Right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to, instead of right-clicking to add a new module, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just click once, and then I'm going to drag a line down, click a second time. And if you remember, that opens up just the set of units you can use with whatever this output is. And so what I want is multiply, because I want to be able to say, okay, well, let's say we want the speed to be 100. Well, if I need to multiply it, because if I want it to be, if I'm going in the positive direction, it should be positive 100. If I'm going in the negative direction, it should be negative 100. So I'm going to go ahead and select multiply. And then I'm going to need to create a new variable. And so I'm going to come up here to my variables, which should be there. If my mouse decides to continue listening, there we go. And so I'm going to create a new variable name, and this is just going to be called speed. I'm going to hit plus, and I'm going to make this type a float. And I'll set the value to 100 to start with. Now, once I've done that, something I've noticed is if I click and drag up here, oh, now it's going to work perfectly fine the first time. Great. Earlier today when I was trying to set up for this, it wasn't letting me drag this down until I clicked off in space down here somewhere, and then, okay. So pull your speed variable down here, and we're going to connect this into the B for this multiply. And then rather than this just going straight over to X, we are going to have it go from here to our X value. Okay, so now we've got this all set, and we're ready to see how this works. Now, there's one problem with what we're doing here. So if we do this, we're going to get a pretty intense amount of force added to this. Let's go ahead and play this. And I'm going to just... okay, so now I'm playing this. So I'm going to hit the letter D, and you'll see that I barely touched it. If I go really fast, it's just going to keep flying off into infinity. All right, so we don't want that to happen, right? We want this to be more controllable. And the other thing that that we haven't talked about is, though there are a set number of frames per second, there's a lot of things that can happen on a computer, on a game console, wherever, that make it so those frames don't redraw at exactly the same rate every time. And so sometimes, it'll be, let's say, 50 milliseconds between two frames. Other times it'll be 53 milliseconds between two frames, or 48 or something like that, right? It's going to vary somewhat. And so what we need, if we want to be able to have like a reasonably uniform amount of force being applied each frame based on the actual real world time that's going on, is we need to be able to check the change in time from the last frame. And so what we can do to do that is there's a function or a unit called, it's called time, capital T-I-M-E, dot delta time. And so if I just type time.del, there's time.delta time get. That's the one we want. What this does is delta is just right, is literally Latin for change. And so it's the change in time. I guess it's not literally Latin for change. It's mathematics for change, right? The symbol delta, the triangle symbol, is what is used in mathematics and stuff to indicate change. And so we're looking for the change in time. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to create another multiply unit, and we're going to multiply this by the product of our speed and our axis input. And then that output will go into the x value of our rigid body. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to select multiply, and I'm going to hit Command or Control C and Command or Control V, and that will paste it. And then I can pull the output from that into the input here. I can grab time delta time, slap it in there, and then I can take the output of that and actually drop it back into the x. Okay, so I have made this up. So let's go ahead and see how this works. These are all the units we should need for this axis of motion. Okay, so you'll see I have even though I have 100 units of force, I have a lot more control here. And what's nice about this is now if I go and say, oh, I do want it to be faster or slower, I can really fine tune the amount of force that I'm adding to this when I'm pressing on these keys. Right? Before I had pretty limited quantities, but now it's also, right, it's going to be uniform, and really it'll stay uniform even depending on if I'm using, right, if I was developing this on my computer, and then I moved to a cell phone or something like that for the actual gameplay, I built it for that. Even though it's a wholly different processor and the time is going to be going at a different, in terms of how long or what the frame rate is, it's going to basically make sure that this stays the same and the motion isn't crazy on a computer that's much slower, or it's really slow on a computer that's faster. Right? This is going to make sure that everything is good across the board. Okay, so I've created this, and this isn't for one axis. Now, I'm going to need to do this for the other axis, and there might be other objects, or maybe I have multiple players or things like that, where I'm going to be creating this a lot. And so what I can do is I can create something called a SuperUnit. And a SuperUnit basically just takes a set of units and makes them into their own little subgraph. And then it presents just like a singular unit in our graph that has all of these things combined. So you can use it either just to organize things and make it cleaner, or if it's something that you're going to reuse, you can do that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take this unit here and we're going to make it a SuperUnit. Now, because we might want different types of update events to happen, or we might want it to just fit nicely into a chain of things and flow, rather than being stuck to this update. The things that we are going to include in this are going to be the get axis, the multiplies, the add force, and this time delta time. We're going to leave this out because we're actually going to have another input here for this variable to come in. And we're actually going to create an input that allows us to set this axis name through a variable as well. Okay, so the first step in this is going to be I'm going to zoom out on my graph a bit, and I'm just going to select all of these objects independently because I don't want to select that, and I kind of overlapped that some. And I'm just going to drag these down so they're a little bit more out of the way. And then I'm going to go ahead and zoom in and center this part of the graph. And now that I've done that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click, I'm going to deselect everything, right click, and I'm going to type in super, if I spell it correctly. And what I want is this very top one called SuperUnit, and you'll say it's in nesting. So I've got this SuperUnit. So now how do I use this? How do I edit this? How do I make changes? What's going on? So I've got the SuperUnit. So first in the graph inspector, we should title this. And what we should say is, let's say, convert axis to force. Something like that, right? Because that's exactly what we're doing, right? We're converting our axis input, it could be convert axis input to force, right? And what this means is any axis, and right, you saw that there were like a ton of different axes listed in the input set manager. And so we could put any axis name in here now and use this to do the same thing. So we've got that set. What we want to do is we want to grab all the units we're going to include in this right now. So I'm just going to select all of these except for the update and the get variable. And I'm going to hit Command C or Control C on Windows to copy it. And then I'm going to select my SuperUnit here. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to click Edit Graph. And you'll see that by default, I already have this input and output unit in here, but there's nothing attached to that whatsoever. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Command or Control V to paste these units, and I'm going to make sure these are not overlapped. And so now what we need to do is we've got everything in here, but we need to be able to get the input stuff in and the output stuff out. And the only output we'll have on this really is going to be this force, is the flow. So let's start with the output. So I'm going to go ahead and select the output. And there's two options here. There's the control outputs and the value outputs. Right? And the control outputs are basically the flow. So if I click on plus, and I'm just gonna name this exit. It could be flow or control or whatever. I'm just gonna name it exit, right? And I'm gonna come out here, and you'll see that now I've got this option over here on my output that says exit. And so I can go ahead and click on this and connect it there. All right, so now any flow that comes through this is going to shoot out the other side, which is one of the things we want. So let's go ahead and select our input. Now the input's a little different because we need one control input, which is our flow. So we're just going to go ahead and we could just call this, we could call it flow, we could call it whatever we want. All right, so I've got the flow there, and I'm going to want to have that jump over to here, and you'll see that illuminates the entire scene now. So then what I need to do is I need to come down to my value inputs. Note that it does have my control outputs listed as well here, right? And my value outputs, so which we're not going to have any. So value inputs, I'm going to need two things. So first, I need this axis name, which is exactly what I'm going to call it, so that it just stays the same. And then I'm going to need to set the type. And the type, it's the orange dot, which you can just compare here, but that's a string. And a string is just, what all it is they say it's a string of characters, right? So it's a word, it's a sentence, it's a paragraph, it can be really long. In our case, it's a single word. So I'm going to say string, axis name, I'm going to go ahead and connect that there. And then the last thing I'm going to need is I need the I'm going to need the multiplier, right? I need the speed of this object. And so I'm going to go ahead and come down here to the plus in the value inputs one more time. And I'm just going to name this speed as well. And I'm going to change the type to float, right? Because it should match the type that's being multiplied here. So I'm going to bring that over. Okay. So now my super unit, it should be done and should be functional. So what I'm going to do is it's like, okay, well now this graph is up. How do I get back to the graph on my player? To get back to the graph on my player, I just come over to, I make sure my player is selected. I come over here and click on Edit Graph. When I do that, now you'll see I have this super unit here, and there's the flow, the axis name, the speed, and the exit, right? And so what I'm going to do is I can just come down here with a couple of these things. I can take my speed and just drop it in here. I can actually take the flow here and put it in here, and then I can take this exit out and drop it in there. And you'll note that I'm actually able to connect multiple things, and I might want, and this input is not really doing anything over here right now. So I'm going to deselect all of that, and I'm going to, right, and the way, if you've forgotten how to disconnect a wire, you hover over the one end and you right click to disconnect it. So I'm going to go ahead and connect to this to here, and I'm going to get really I'm going to go ahead and delete all of these because I do not need them anymore. So if I select them all and then right click and hit delete selection, they will all disappear. So I can pull this up here. Now the other thing that I need to do is I'm missing my axis name. And so I need to create another variable. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to call this variable is only going to be housing the axis that I want to use, right? And I want to use a horizontal axis and I want to use a vertical axis. And so I'm going to call this one H axis. I'm going to hit plus. The type of variable is going to be a string. And then I'm just going to type the string I want to send into my super unit is horizontal with a capital H. Okay, so I've done that. I've just clicked in the graph once because I found that if I do that and then click and drag, oh, sometimes I get a better option. It seems like if I click too close to the value here, it's unhappy, but if I click up here, it seems to drag occasionally. I have no idea what's going on here, like why this is being so fussy, but it's being pretty fussy for me today. Okay, so now I've got this get variable, h-axis, and I can run this right into the axis name. Okay, now if everything is good, this should work exactly as it did previously, except I've made one mistake. I don't actually need to add force again because it's already housed inside this super unit. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this. And we don't actually need any flow coming out of here yet, but we will in just a little bit. So let's go ahead and see what happens. Now, there is something that may be problematic with the way I've done this, and we can just we can fix that in a bit. Okay, so let's see if we get this to work. All right, look at that. It's working exactly the same as it did previously. Everybody's happy. Fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and stop that. And so now that we've got this super unit, what we can do is now we can also do the vertical axis in the same exact way. We don't need to create another super unit. We can actually right click and go add unit, and we should now be able to say convert, and let's see here if it actually shows up the one that I made. Okay, so what I can do now is I can select this super unit, and I can hit Command C to copy it, Command V to paste it, and then I want this flow to continue to here because this is all going to come from this one update event. And then with speed, I can just click here and drag, and so speed is being sent into both. Now, if for some reason I wanted this to not be able to go sideways as quickly as it went forward and backward, I could have a second speed variable with a different value there. And then the other thing I need to do is I need to create one more variable. And so I'm going to name this new variable v-axis. And I'm going to hit plus. And I'm going to change the type to string. And then in that value there, I'm going to type in vertical with a capital V. I'm going to select, click on here. And again, it's doing this. It wants me to do it twice. And so now I've got this vertical axis. I can pull this in, drop it into axis name. And if I hit play, I should now be able to move horizontally or vertically. Now, the question is if, oh, okay, so there's a problem here, right? I can hit W and S, but it's moving me in the same direction as A and D is. And that's because when I did this, I made a mistake and didn't do it correctly. So let's look at what's going on. So I'm going to select this SuperUnit. And this is going to break the graph as soon as I do that. But I'm going to go ahead and click. Note when you have your SuperUnit, instead of clicking on in the inspector to edit the graph, you need to actually click in this graph inspector. And so now that I've got my graph inspector set up and I've got this set, note here's where the problem is, right? I'm coming through here and I have this multiply set and I'm sending it into the X direction. So in this SuperUnit, even though I'm getting the other axis, I'm actually sending all, because I'm doing the same thing, I'm sending it into the X into the X direction for both SuperUnits. So I actually need to remove this rigid body add force from my SuperUnit and then actually have an output that has a value output. So I'm going to select my rigid body add force. I'm going to right click. I'm going to delete this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here. I'm going to have this flow go all the way across. And you'll see that this is all kind of grayed out at this point. But that should be fine, because what I need to do now is I need to come over here to output, and I need to select it, I need to add a value output, and that value output we'll call it force, and the type is going to be a float. Okay. And then what we need to do is we just need to take the output from this final multiply here and drop it into the force. And that should illuminate everything, which means it's all connected and happy. Okay, I'm just gonna hit save just to make sure. And now I'm gonna go back to edit graph here. And you'll see that now this force is here. And if I was to try and run this, absolutely nothing would happen. But what I need to do is I need to take, and you'll note it fixed this one, but it didn't fix this one. All right, so I'm actually going to delete that SuperUnit for the time being. And I'm going to go ahead and create a rigid body add force unit. So I'm going to say rigid body dot add. And again, I just need the add force .x or the add force XYZ. And when I do that, now I can take this exit, send it into add force. Although actually, I don't want to do that because I'm going to need this other one in here. So I'm going to get rid of that real quick. But what I do want to send over there is this force, right? This is from my horizontal axis. So I do want this to go into the X. But then what I need to do is I need to select this SuperUnit. I need to copy it and paste it. And then I'm going to take this exit into my flow. And then I'm going to take this exit into here, right? So these are all connected. And now I just need to reconnect the axis name and speed. So the axis name is this vertical axis. And then the speed is the same as over here. And then this force is going to go out and it's going to go into the X, right? We're not dealing with Y here. That's what the jump code does separately. But we are dealing with our X and Z motion. Okay, so now that I've done that, let's see if this works a little bit better. Okay, so first let's test the vertical. All right, so we've got vertical motion. And now if I test the horizontal, we've got horizontal motion. Okay, so now we've got a sphere that can run around the plane and can also jump in the air. Now note, when it jumps in the air, it actually stops all motion in the other directions, which is something we could fix later. I'm not too concerned about it right now because we've at least figured out how to do this, which is great. And so, fantastic. All right, so we are going to stop this tutorial here, and the next tutorial will cover how to make the camera follow the object.